Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles. Today is December 27th, and I'm putting the show together here in Ocean Park, Maine. I drove up from Cambridge for a couple of nights to have supper with my daughter, Sarah, Josh, and her son, James. We're going to see Star Wars tomorrow, so that's exciting. Appropriate, too, because this episode I'm going to bring you a lengthy interview I did with a friend of my father's at the place that he lives west of Boston. Robert C. Cowen is the retired science journalist and editor at the Christian Science Monitor. That's a really renowned newspaper in its day. It ceased publishing in print a while ago, and it has a weekly version. But I remember it when I was getting into journalism as really one of the most prestigious places that you could write. And I think I had an interview there probably after I graduated from business school. And at that time, Bob Cowen would have been in the newsroom there as a science writer, so our paths would have crossed if I'd ever ended up at the Monitor myself. But he did, and he had a fascinating career. In this first part of the interview that I'm going to play for you, he talks about how he ended up majoring in meteorology at MIT and then working for the Christian Science Monitor and then meeting the woman who would become his wife. So the first question I had was, why meteorology?
Oh, that's an interesting story, and not what you would think. But I've been interested in flying and aviation, so I matriculated as a aeronautical engineer, and rapidly discovered that meant acres of engineer drawing dull pictures and so forth, and didn't seem very interesting. Then I discovered, in those days, the meteorology department was part of the aeronautical engineering department. It was 2 floors. Everybody was on the floor together, all the professors, the graduate students, the undergraduate students. You were there all the time. And so I switched. and it was terrific because instead of all these crazy engineering drawings, I did have to draw weather maps, which I found a little boring. But I was with the whole gang all the time, and that was the real education. There were 2 reasons I did not have a normal Joe College education. Mm-hmm. One was universal. The GIs came back, and they were not interested in Joe College. Yeah. So you didn't have the same kind of climate around the campus. Yeah. But number 2, except for maybe half a dozen or less undergraduates, there were no undergraduates in my department, just graduate students. But there were lots and lots of fellow students, mid-career people, sent there by their governments to learn. And so I'd look to my right and I'd see a major from the Air Force. Look to my left, I'd see a mid-level civil servant. Yeah. So my gang, my fellow students, were all mature people. I did not go through college with a bunch of young guys trying to find out who they were. Right. Or young gals.
Yeah, these are established people.
Established people. And boy, did that ever pay off.
Because that sort of made you more serious than you would have been if you just...
I learned so much more. I didn't have to even pretend to be interested in the Joe College stuff. Yeah. And one of the groups was a contingent of about 3 people from the Philippines, from their weather service. And now you fast forward a couple of decades, and I get a call from the Philippine embassy saying, your tickets are in the mail. I said, what are you talking about? It turned out that Marcus had wanted to make Manila a hub for big international groups. And Imelda, his wife, had said, let's do it on development. And so they set up this worldwide development conference. And then I got invited as part of the press. Oh. And we talked about it and thought, okay, we'll go, but be careful for their propaganda and stuff and all that. And so I went. Well, I got to Manila, I think on our dime, not theirs. Mm-hmm. And they didn't know what to do with the press. Yeah. The people setting it. They didn't know. And it was a mess. And and I was standing there wondering what to do. And I heard somebody say, oh, it's Bob, come on over here. It's the Manila guys I went to school with.
MIT.
They're now running the weather service. Oh. So come over here, you're a scientist, you be with us.
Nice.
So I got that way. And the meeting, I was sitting next to our own National Science Advisor.
Well, the rest of the press guys were off in some pen somewhere.
Oh, somewhere, yeah. But more than that, I probably saved the career of I think it's a guy who was in charge of the Geological Survey. Because it being the usual game, they would knock on our hotel door early, and an attractive young woman there offering us some money and stuff because they want you to have a good time. Oh. And I told her, forget it, my paper pays for everything.
Wow.
And then I found out this guy was going to take it.
Ooh.
I gave him a lecture.
Yeah.
And said, look, you might as well take the knife and do this.
Yeah.
If that gets out, you're dead.
Right. So he didn't.
He didn't.
And then he went on to have a career.
Yeah.
But for your warning.
Oh, yeah, I thought, good heavens, don't these guys know better than that?
Yeah.
They're in the U.S. Civil Service.
Yeah. Well, and luckily, I mean, you were working not only for a major newspaper, but for the Christian Science Monitor, known for its ethics and standards. So you certainly had the benefit of all of that support.
Yeah. But anyway, that's how I got into meteorology.
Yeah.
And then meteorology became part of the Earth Atmospheric and Planetary Science Department at MIT. And now they're having a big rethink as to what the department should be and should it change its name. I'm urging them to, and I guess some others are, to call it planetary science. Because that's what we're doing. We're doing not just the whole solar system, but we're also doing planetary systems around other stars. And that's the future.
So climate change, I assume, is part of that.
Part of that. Oh, very much. And the other thing that was important in my going there is that people I worked with intimately went on to be people running the show for the U.S. For example, the guy who established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, not NASA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Bob White, he was the senior guy on the research project where I was the low guy on the totem pole doing some of the computations. And Ed Lorenz, for whom they've now named a whole center there, who discoverer of chaos theory and all that, he was another one on there. So, I got to know these guys, and that's invaluable.
Yeah, you got not only an education, but entrance into a network that just kept getting more important.
That's right. And not only that, but Professor Victor Starr, who's a very quiet guy, but very deep thinker and a good scientist, we'd all go off to lunch together and talk about science in general, and speculate about what the astronomers were finding and so forth. I mean, that was my real education.
Wow.
I really learned how scientists think.
It looks like in 1950, happens to be the year I was born, is when you went to the Christian Science Monitor.
Oh, yeah, that was totally out of the blue.
How did that happen?
Well, that's another thing that my friends who have to put up with my peccadillos and so forth would say, oh, that's Bob Cowan again. But the Christian Scientists had an organization at MIT as well. And we invited the manager of the Christian Science Publishing Society, which publishes the Monitor, among other things, to come over and give us a talk about what to think about when you're outside facing the world. And he gave a good talk, but he totally mixed up nuclear physics and chemistry. So I made an appointment with him, and I thanked him for coming, and said I thought somebody of his prominence in the Christian Science Church should know the difference between these things, and proceeded to set him right.
Oh, and you were an 18, 19-year-old at the time?
No, probably about 23.
20, yeah.
But it's still just a student college.
Yeah.
So he laughs, and then he says, have you ever thought of working for the Christian Science Monitor?
Oh. And
so I go back to the lab. I call him up and said, are you serious? I had never written a thing for publication in my life. He said, talk to the editor. So I called the editor up and said, what's up? He said, come over for lunch. So I went over for lunch, and I went out with him and essentially his number two. They said, hey, look, we're in a bind. The science writer we had is gone. It's front page news, and there's not a single person on the staff who can cover it. Would you consider cutting short your education at MIT and coming here and jump-starting our coverage? So I went back, and I made an appointment with the chairman of MIT, and said, "What should I do?" He didn't hesitate. I said, "Look, I'm starting my thesis. I'm got a full scholarship, and I got a livable salary as a graduate research assistant." Karl Compton says, "Forget it. We turn out too many PhDs and SCDs. Take the job. It's more important. Public understanding of science is more important." So they let me take a quick master's degree. And I had all the things. They accepted my proposal for the doctorate research as my thesis. And when I think back on it now, I think that Karl Compton, the chairman of MIT, had said that there was no way they were not going to give me the master's degree.
They were going to make it work.
Going to make it work. And so I went to the Monitor.
How long after you had that lunch with the editor was your first day? Did this all happen pretty quickly?
Oh, it did. Yeah, I took the summer off, and I wrote one or two things for them. And then, this happened, in May, something like that. Yeah. And then I went to the first workday of September. Huh. Yeah, I think the first day of September was a Saturday, and I went the following Monday. Yeah.
Do you remember the first story you covered for them?
I can remember the first page one story. But it was a very interesting introduction. Of course, the other people on the paper, staff and so on, didn't know why I was hired. I wasn't coming in the normal way.
Yeah.
And they didn't know that I wasn't being paid the normal salary either.
Oh, boy.
But the difference was little.
Yeah.
I'll get to that later. I brought the essential things. If you're going to jumpstart world coverage of science, the fact that you'd never written for a newspaper at that time was irrelevant. What was relevant was, do you have the credentials scientists respect?
Yes.
Do you know them? Do you have enough entree? Do you know how scientists think? And do you know how to go about making it work?
Yeah.
I had all that.
Exactly.
Karl Compton, the MIT chairman, became a mentor after that. He would open doors. And so would a friend of mine who ran the Harvard Observatory, and a few others. They could open doors. And there was one door he opened that really knocked me off my chair. So I had that. Then I had to learn how to write for the newspaper and so on, which was another can't-fail situation. Since I would be covering stories that had to go in the paper, I would get the attention of the top editor, who would make sure it was right to go in the paper.
Well, do you remember your first time sitting at a typewriter on deadline and any kind of panic you had about that part of the job?
No.
Because you had been a writer. You would have had to write things when you were at MIT.
A few.
Yeah.
But I figured writing was an art. So I did what I normally did at MIT. I was one of those students who, in a lot of courses, thought, shut up about the course. Give me the book and let me study it. Let me teach myself.
Right.
And so I thought, well, it's an art. So I studied the biographies and the how-to books of great writers like Somerset Maugham and so forth, and dancers like Agnes de Mille and Stanislavsky, an actor prepares.
Yeah.
And my friends in the acting business tell me that's the classic. So I studied all these things and how they thought about it. That was a big help. And then the national editor told me, we can teach you journalism, we can't teach you science journalism. Go write for another science editor on a non-competing publication. And so I did some of that. But when I first arrived on the Monitor, I think in my first 6 weeks, I did something like 36 stories, some of them small. But one of them was my first byline. But my first page one byline showed why my background paid off. It was the epical announcement of the original cloud seeding rainmaking experiments at GE with Vince Schaefer. And I thought at the time, I bet I'm the only one here with a freshly minted degree in meteorology from MIT.
Covering the story. That had to be a huge advantage because I had a similar experience because when I graduated from Harvard Business School, I had a little bit of journalism at the Woonsocket Call, a small paper. But when I joined the business staff at the Providence Journal, I didn't have years of business reporting, but I had an MBA from Harvard. And when I went down and sat down with the head of Textron, I knew what a balance sheet was, and there was just sort of a confidence because I knew the language and some of the people as well.
Well, the science writing scene then and now is self-organized. Mm-hmm. It's different from a lot of journalism. We have a lot of internal education. And in those days particularly, we didn't think it violated journalistic ethics to be close to our sources. So the professional societies, like the American Chemical Society or physics and so forth, they would throw all-day seminars on an important announcement for us. And every year there'd be several days of a retreat where we and selected people, selected scientists we invited, would all be together.
It'd be kind of off the record where they were preparing you?
No, everything was on the record.
Oh, okay.
And we...
but you had plenty of time.
Plenty of time.
Yeah.
And lots of people to sit down with you for lunch and explain it.
Sure.
So that was a big help. But the thing that knocked me off my seat, and still does when I think back on it, about the value of the contacts, and I'm going to have to speculate a bit about it, is that after 2 years on the job, I thought it was time to get some overseas experiment. Mm-hmm. So to get this experience, I thought I'd go and locate in London and do all of British science for maybe a 3-month period. Mm-hmm. And I said to the boss, look, you pay my airfare one way, I'll pay it coming back, and I'll live on my salary. Because in those days, England was cheap and you could live on a salary, a starting salary. And they said, okay. So I did it. Well, I arrive in London in our bureau, and there's a letter there for me. And I look at it. It's from Prince Louis de Broglie.
Who is?
One of the founders of quantum physics.
Okay.
Whom I've never met, who had no reason to know anything about me, very world-famous physicist. He's inviting me to tea in Paris. The only thing I can think of is that Karl Compton put him up to it.
Yeah. The chairman of MIT said, we have a guy coming over there you need to get to know. And so he invites you to tea.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite a start for the new bureau staffer.
Yeah, and I was never a bureau staffer, even though I later worked out of the London bureau for 2 years. The bureau chief was told that I ran my own show, reported directly back to the foreign editor. He was to give me every facility. The accountant was to give me any money I asked for on my signature, and I accounted back for it to Boston. And I made all my arrangements, got all my permission to get money and spend it directly from there. And so, in a sense, was a obligatory guest in the bureau. And I could tell you, the London bureau chief and later the Washington bureau chief took a little while to get used to the fact that I didn't come to their morning briefings and so forth.
Yeah, I could picture a little resentment.
I don't think so, but yeah. I think they were perplexed. But I learned something about bureaucracy, where a guy who had to deal with them all the time said, remember to cultivate the secretaries and so forth. So I took the chief accountant out to lunch.
Yeah.
And we had it, and maybe you could tell me things I ought to know about getting along in Britain.
Exactly.
Oh yes, don't you? Good. I'll see to it that everything is right.
Well, how big a bureau did the Monitor have in those days?
We had a whole building.
London? In London, you had a whole building?
Yeah, a small building, which no longer exists.
Yeah.
And we had some stringers, but we had several correspondents. So we had a bureau chief and a deputy, and don't have any of that now. And the building we had was torn down for I think it's the University of London, but it was located right in the heart of London, right outside the gates of the city.
Well, now that was in the kind of if not the height of the Cold War. The Cold War was really dominating.
It was
everything.
1952.
Did they draw you in on some of the stories about the struggle with Russia and communism from the science point of view?
Yeah.
What
that was one of my big stories. And, well, among other things, some of my friends, like the director of Harvard Observatory, and of the scientists, there were targets.
Targets of actual, like trying to assassinate them, or
no, politically.
Oh,
no, they were targets for the Massachusetts legislator, communist hunters, all these liberals.
This is McCarthy
and the McCarthy, yeah.
Oh,
yeah. Oh no, I was reporting a lot on that. Yeah, that was an era that people are fussing now. They don't know what it was like. They really don't know what it was like.
Do you see the current time as similar in some ways?
Oh, I do, but it's a junior edition.
I see. The McCarthy era was really more dangerous.
Much more dangerous for these people. This is more dangerous in that it's promoting the America First people and so forth who wanted to be an all-white country and that kind of thing. Domestic terrorism.
Right. That wasn't so much back then.
No.
Did you in your role as a journalist covering people who were targets of McCarthy, did you have to walk a fine line in how you covered stories that could be used one way or the other in that struggle?
I didn't think of it as a fine line. I just reported it.
Yeah.
And we wrote editorials and columns and so forth.
Yeah.
But have an interesting confluence of that with an important life event for me. They had a meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in San Francisco, and in those days it met around Christmas time, between Christmas and New Year's. So I came back from a tour in Europe and got on an airplane and came out there to cover that. It turned out during that meeting, the president of the AAAS was attacked by McCarthy. Yeah. So they stopped the whole thing and had a plenary meeting to support him. Yeah. And then we had a dinner for the press. They had, and we met in, I think it was called the Bohemian Club, I'm not sure. Anyway, I got seated in a fortunate position. I had Edward Teller here, and I think Bill Lawrence of the New York Times here, and Ernest Lawrence over there. And these three, the two Lawrences
and Teller, I remember that name. Who was he?
Edward Teller?
Yeah,
the
I remember.
inventor of the H-bomb?
Right, okay.
The one whom all the physicists dumped on because they thought he'd betrayed Oppenheimer.
Oh, yeah.
And he was being ostracized. So Teller was moaning in my ear about this. And the other two were cooking up a scheme whereby Ernest Lawrence and his colleagues would publish a scientific paper giving more credit to Edward Teller. I see. And meanwhile, I thought, oh boy, this is an opportunity. So I whispered to Edward Teller, look, really like to get your side off the record if you want. Can we do it? He said, yeah, come and see me. So I went to see him at his home. And his wife was saying, it's awful what they're doing to Edward. And he gave me this long editorial, which was...
That he had written?
No.
Oh, that you...
That I would write of the interview.
I see, yeah.
And I swore to him we would not publish it until he was dead. And I held on to that for decades. And we published it, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so.
Really?
Yeah. Because he let his hair way down as to how he felt.
Trusted you. That was a lot of trust he put in you.
Yeah, and I trusted the editors because I shared it with them.
Yeah.
Said we cannot publish this until he's gone.
And that's because it would have made him a target if...
Even more, but it would have broken my word.
But why did he want it to be withheld until after his death?
Oh, because it was very candid.
I see,
Yeah. It was him exposing his inner demons. Well, okay, so you can see this is an exciting thing for me.
Yeah.
And you can also imagine me coming in on the airplane with the same kind of coat on I used to see these war correspondents have, and I'm all jazzed up that I've been talking to these ministers of science and so forth, and I've got this big story. I'm invited to stay with I guess it was the son-in-law of an official of our church out there. Well, I was out there, and he said, well, look, we're having a New Year's party. I'll get you a date. The time the date was over, we decided to get married.
Oh.
I had never... it was the last thing in my mind. Here I am, I'm doing this great adventure and so forth. What's this marriage business? Get out of the way. So, boom.
That was a pretty eventful trip.
It was a pretty eventful trip.
One of my favorite parts of that part of the conversation with Bob is how he took to learning how to write by reading some really great books, including the one that I've heard of before is An Actor Prepares by Stanislavsky, and then books about the methods of W. Somerset Maugham and the dancer Agnes de Mille. Great intellectual confidence that he showed that he picked up at MIT by reading books instead of wading through a less efficient way of learning in the classroom sometimes. As I have been listening to this interview here at the cottage, I did a lot of deleting of my side of the conversation because I kept saying, wow. He would say something about, meeting some of these famous people and then starting his career. And I think I probably deleted about 10 wows, but you'll probably detect in just my enthusiasm for talking with him that I was pretty impressed with the story, and I really enjoyed it. I did find the article that he mentioned based on a conversation with Edward Teller. It's titled A Long Ago Moment with Edward Teller, and it was published September 12, 2003. That was 48 years after the interview that Bob had with Teller in 1955. So 48 years, that's a long time to keep a promise of confidentiality until the passing of Edward Teller. So that column had been reserved somewhere at the Christian Science Monitor for nearly 50 years before it was finally published. Pretty intriguing. It's a very well-written column, and I recommend it to you. You'll find a link to it in the show notes. Let's turn back to the interview. By the way, I conducted the interview in my father's office at the place that he lives, so Bob and I were there together, and the acoustics were pretty good, and I recorded the whole thing on my iPhone. I've learned to trust the audio quality of my iPhone on the trip to Europe. Very simple just to put that on the table and have a conversation. When we resume, you'll hear Bob talk about his the woman that he decided in one night on this trip in San Francisco that they were going to be married.
Well, tell me about your wife now. What was she doing at the time that you met?
She had just finished up her college education.
In San Francisco, or?
No, she'd gone to Northwestern.
Oh, okay.
And she'd done had gone around Europe and so forth to see things. And was sort of at a loose end, I think. But wondering what she was going to do next.
Yeah. How long was it after you met her on that trip that you got engaged and married?
That night.
That you got engaged that night or married that night?
No, yeah. Well, we knew we were going to do it.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I was there for a couple of weeks getting stories.
I see. And then
she's down there and I'm up here.
Yeah.
And a long distance romance isn't going to work.
No.
So I went into her parents and said, I think I can take your daughter off your hands.
That's romantic.
Yeah, and they said, well, we don't know about that, but they were very good.
Yeah.
And
where did they live?
In Pasadena.
Uh-huh.
Within walking distance of Caltech.
Oh, good.
Which made it a good base later on.
Yeah.
And so I went home, and I'm sitting in our apartment. I should say that me and two other guys were living high on the hog on low salaries. Two of them were graduate students, and I had a beginning salary at the Monitor. And it suddenly hit me, I'm going to have to support a wife. Can I do it?
Yeah.
And there's a knock on the door, and it's the executive vice president of Arthur D. Little. And he comes in with the usual pitch of this kind. Yeah. We're thin at the top, and we were wondering if you wanted to join us, and so forth. And he offers me my boss's salary.
Oh. Now what do you do?
And I said, well, I think I'd like to stay with the Monitor. Well, will they let you consult with us?
Oh.
And so I go back, and I tell them this. And I suppose now it would curl the hair of the editor or something, but they said, yes, you can consult with them to help them with their writing and stuff, but you can't write about anything they do.
Yeah.
So they put me on a retainer, and my salary went up 40%.
And you were able to stay at the Monitor.
Able to stay at the Monitor.
And you could afford a wife.
And when there was well, there's more to that. And when there was a project that I got on, every day was another $50.
Oh.
Which was good money in those days.
Yeah.
And we got on some interesting projects. So I got an opportunity to see how a company, which now gone belly up, and would have done better if it stuck to its original ethics and not tried to spread itself too thinly.
Yeah.
But I got to see how.
Did you ever? Was it Royal Little was the founder of that?
Yep. But I got to see how they operated, how they thought, and so forth.
Yeah.
And that was a good part of my education, and it helped my monitor work.
That's interesting. So the monitor's line was, you can do this, but because you're working for them, there would be a conflict of interest if you covered them as a reporter.
That's right.
So they were just off your beat.
It's off the beat.
Yeah. That's the right approach.
They were off the beat for the monitor. But later on, when I became American correspondent for British Communications and Electronics, they were not off the beat for that.
Yeah. Huh.
But
well, now did you?
But Mary, I didn't know that Mary had her own money.
Oh.
But she had a small stipend.
I see.
And so that helped.
Too. Yeah.
So we put the two together.
Yeah.
And I was earning what was the top dollar on the monitor then. With all three things together.
Yeah.
And from then on, we never worried about money.
And at that time, were you living in Boston?
No. These two other guys and me, we weren't going to settle for that.
Oh.
So we went around to the newest building in Cambridge, 100 Memorial Drive, with all the fancy balconies.
Yeah.
And we got an apartment that three people could live in for $150 a month. And my salary was $55 a week.
Now, is that the high-rise 1010 Memorial Drive?
No, that was before that.
Oh, where was 100 Memorial? That would have been
it's
closer
that
to the
complex.
square.
It's that complex right on the river.
Oh, yeah.
With all the balconies.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
And it was the newest thing in town.
Right.
And so we went in there. We all could afford it.
Yeah.
And we lived high on the hog. We laid down the rule that the meals had to be gourmet quality.
Yeah.
And therefore we all had to learn to cook, which we did. I learned to make bread. I made our own homemade bread.
Wow.
And I cooked the meats and so forth. Another one did the veg, and the chemist did the desserts.
Yeah.
I didn't ask him what he put in them.
It could have been anything.
I didn't ask him what he did when he cleaned the kitchen.
Right.
I cleaned the head and swept the living room.
Yeah.
And I think another one did the bedrooms. He did the kitchen, and we had to leave when he did it. And he said, because I'm taking chemicals out of the lab, I'm not supposed to take out of the lab.
Oh, for the cleaning?
Yeah.
Oh, my.
I never knew what it was.
Don't want to know.
Don't want to know. Yeah, that's how I got started.
Interesting. And so during that whole period, 1950 to 1995, were you at the Monitor that whole period, or were you doing some other work at other newspapers?
No. Just occasional freelance.
I see. Okay.
No, Monitor's my career.
Yeah. And then after 1995, I read you still kept writing. In fact, you
for the
Monitor.
I thought it was time to get out of the way.
Yeah.
And so I retired, and then I retired on Friday, and then Monday I was back at work at the desk on a contract.
I see.
And I did that for 15 years.
Yeah.
And most people didn't know I was retired.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
Yeah.
And then you did some writing for Technology Review.
Oh, it was more than that. I had a big connection with through the Alumni Association. Not as big as a lot of other people, but continuing. And I was on a visiting committee for humanities for a long time, stuff like that.
Right.
But in I think late 1950s, early 60s, MIT as president decided they'd like to have a prestige publication in the public marketplace.
Oh.
And the Alumni Association said, let us turn Technology Review into that publication.
Oh.
And they set up a committee. And the guy who tried to hire me for Arthur D. Little was chairman of the committee. And I was his vice chair. And so we hired the proper consultants and everything, redesigned the magazine, wrote its mission statement, hired the staff, did all that stuff, and got it going. And then I joined their advisory committee for years and years and years, and became a columnist.
And it became a major publication. I mean, now it's one of the leading technology journals.
Yes. We hired John Mattel, who was crucial to making it that, which is rather interesting since he was sort of technophobia, but he sure could turn out a good technology magazine.
Yeah.
And I said to the gang, hey, look, we got to pay this guy a decent salary.
Yeah.
What do you think? He said 20,000. Pay him 25.
Yeah.
And so I told John was a neighbor in Conantum over here. I said, well, I just got him to pay you a good salary, 25. Mm-hmm. You know what he said?
What?
That's too much money. And his wife said, John, will you shut up and just take it?
She set him straight.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good Yankee response.
Oh,
Isn't it?
yeah.
Too much money. Oh.
You're trying to pay me too much money.
Oh, gosh.
I thought, hey, look.
That's my final offer. That's a strange negotiation.
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
so that's how I got involved with Tech Rev.
Yeah. Well, now, and you got quite an award in 2001, the American Geophysical Union, and it was an award for sustained achievement in science journalism.
Yeah.
And they actually named the award after you. It said that at the ceremony in Boston, you were recognized for, quote, more than 50 years of extraordinary contribution to the public understanding of science.
Yeah.
And you know, when you think about it that way, your sort of calling this whole period is to help the public understand science.
Yes.
And I'm interested if you can kind of imagine how well the public understood science in 1950.
Oh.
And maybe versus 1995 or 2000, just, you know, the span of your career. Do you think the public understands science any better now or recently than it did back in 1950?
I would say I think it understands it better, a bit better, but in general doesn't appreciate it.
Okay.
Did that. But there were two things that were problematic when I started. One was, you know, the traditional thing that the public doesn't really understand science or what it's all about. The other was scientists, too many of them don't want to have anything to do with the public. That's when good public information from scientific organizations was rare.
Yeah.
You had some that were just starting, like the Chemical Society and AAAS and so forth. But you had others, like the American Geophysical Union, which were pathetic.
Well, why were they disdainful of the public's ability to?
They were. They didn't want to bother with them.
Not worth the effort.
Not worth the effort. I want to do my thing, and
dirty your hands with that stuff.
Yeah. And
but
so
that changed over the years.
That changed over the years,
and you probably helped it change.
One of many. I think Walter Sullivan and all and Dave Perlman and all those people did. Dave particularly probably did more in his gang than I did. I was just more spread out on both sides. I wanted the Monitor to be a leader in science writing, not just do our thing. And my predecessor had been one of the founders of the National Association of Science Writers, so I worked at that and went through their offices and so forth. But the American Geophysical Union, which is my major scientific professional group, along with the American Meteorological Society, it was pathetic back there. They did not know what to do with the press.
Like a private club.
Yeah. Well, you know, your geophysicists, I want to study my rocks. I don't want to bother with this. You know, but there was a big awakening when we built that building in Washington, which we just rehabbed.
Headquarters for the
AGU. Because we wanted to float bonds tax-free through the District of Columbia.
Yeah.
And the IRS said, you can't do it unless you make your science available to the public in a form they can understand.
Oh, so there was that kind of pressure.
It's not good enough just to publish a scientific journal.
Yeah.
And so they split the operation that had included lobbying and put lobbying somewhere else and made a full court press on public information.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah. And I joined the committee on that and eventually chaired it. But
well, my impression
they're very good now.
Yeah. You think of Sputnik as triggering great concern that we weren't keeping up with the Russians in science, and then the whole space race and Kennedy's go to the moon. Did that event fundamentally change the relationship between the public and science because of
it did. It did.
And it was really a boost, wasn't it? Then
it was a boost, but it was extremely frustrating for the science writers.
Why is that?
Because we knew we were better than they were in space, technically and so forth. They had these massive rockets to put up hunks of stuff, and we had taken full advantage of von Braun and so forth, and von Braun could have put it up there months ahead of Sputnik. And number two, it wasn't a space race to get the first satellite up. We had agreed, when we agreed to be part of the International Geophysical Year, which was really 18 months, that the United States and Russia would put up satellites. Oh. And we all wrote the story over and over, and what the satellites could do, and so on. So what people were saying, I didn't know they could do that. Don't you ever read anything? And
that must have been frustrating.
Oh, it was. But my big frustration was when Sputnik itself went up. Yeah. Because the official in charge of the program had come to America and was visiting Boston. Huh. And the president of the Rocket Society, who lived in Concord, had him out for dinner. Huh. And then afterwards he called me up and said, come on over, I got something for you. He said, he's told me they're ready to go. And
that the satellite's ready to go?
Ready to go. And so I write the story. Yeah. The Russians are ready to put up their satellite they agreed to. Yeah. The editors buried it.
Oh.
And then Sputnik went up, and I'm there in the morning when they come in, the story half written. And I said, why did you bury my story? Yeah. I had gotten it from the man himself. And you know what they told me?
What?
We didn't believe you.
Really?
Yeah.
It was so dramatic that you would have gotten that.
They were so fixated, in spite of all of the stories I'd written about where we are, that they could not believe when the official in charge of the program told me they were ready to go. They could not believe that story.
Well, was there some decision? It sounds like we could have put a satellite up.
We could.
But did we defer to them somehow? Or how was the decision made that theirs would go up first?
The story came out, I didn't know this at the time. And our people working on our satellites did not know this at the time. Yeah. And very few people knew this at the time. But Eisenhower was very smart. He wanted them to go first.
Because he would use that to build up our capability?
No, he would use it for another purpose.
What?
And I was told, I never verified it myself, that he even had people checking von Braun's rocket to make sure he wouldn't send one up, because he was ready to go. Oh. And when we sent one up, we did it on his rocket. Oh. No, stop and think of it. This is an International Geophysical Year. Yeah. It's a peaceful cooperation. Mm-hmm. The Russians are going to say, we're doing it on behalf of humanity, and a satellite going around the Earth is just like a ship in international waters.
Right.
So bingo, go the spy satellites.
Oh, our spy satellites. Because they've got one up and...
They've got the satellite. They have established the legal footing that we can put up spy satellites and spy on their territory just like a ship in international waters.
Do you think the Russians knew that we were going to do that?
I don't know, but that's the story that came out.
Pretty smart.
It's not a story I developed. It's the story that came out.
Wow, that's some pretty fancy chess going on there.
Yeah.
And there was sort of a secondary benefit for Eisenhower people that wanted us to have a robust scientific presence is that it brought the public along.
It did.
To support the NASA and the whole thing.
It did. Yeah.
Wow.
But it was frustrating for me.
So when that guy that headed the Sputnik program invited you over, he spoke English and you were able to speak with him?
Oh, no. This was the president of the Rocket Society.
Oh, this is our Rocket Society. He's the one that told you it.
Yeah, he had him out for dinner.
But he knew.
Fred Durant.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
No, Fred Durant had fed me a lot of stuff.
I'll be darned.
Yeah.
How about the moon landing, 1969, July? Did you write that story as a front-page story?
I did not.
Oh.
Because at that point in time, we had several science writers.
Okay.
Often I was the only one. We had several. And a year or so before, I'd gotten a call from, trying to remember now whether it was the National Academy or the Smithsonian, they wanted to set up a bureau in Europe, in London, and offered me the fellowship to do it. Go over for a year or two and do something. And our trustees had said, well, we really need you here, but it's a good opportunity, so you go and do it, and we'll continue your benefits. And I said, well, the light went off in my head. Yeah. I said, oh boy, this is an opportunity that they don't see. And I said, well, I think you're right. I'll stay here and let somebody else do it. And the guy who did it, Vic McElhaney, went on now to establish all of that wonderful science journalism at MIT. Oh. But Vic did it. Then, a couple of years later, we had all these science writers. So I went to the boss and I said, hey, look, I didn't take that thing. Help us. But now if I go over there for a year or two, it's not going to hurt anything. Why don't I go over for us?
Good idea.
And so I got over there, and Mary and I lived in London for 2 years.
Nice.
On my arrangement that you give me the money I asked for when I asked for it, and so forth, and I run my own show.
Like the first time. And then, so while you were there was when the moon landing.
So I wrote sidebars.
Yeah.
But I did come home for the next one, for Apollo 12. Yeah. And that kind of thing. But
well, you had a good beat when you think of all the different kinds of writing you could have started doing.
Oh yeah.
The one thing that's interested me, because I follow Amazon and Jeff Bezos, there are these two competing visions that Jeff Bezos has. He has this company, Blue Origin, and Elon Musk, who has SpaceX. And if I understand it right, Bezos is trying to make it affordable just to get payloads up into space. Yeah. He pictures the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people living in space to preserve the planet. Yeah. Because if you've got this kind of growth in energy consumption, and Musk is picturing 1 million people living on Mars in the next 50 to 100 years. He thinks that's the place. And so these two very different views, and Bezos kind of makes fun of Musk sometimes and says, Earth's the best planet, but do you have any kind of if you were to guess which of those two visions might actually unfold in the next 50 to 100 years?
I think both of them.
Both of them.
I don't think the 1 million people on Mars.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be surprised to have bases up there.
Interesting. Also colonizing in space itself or on the moon. And
I do expect major industrial development in cislunar space between here and the moon, and on the moon.
I see.
I do, and I think that's essential before we do anything major on Mars. That's the place to start for.
Right. And so really, the two don't have to compete there.
Oh no, they don't. I think it's just like the airline industry. You get to a point where it becomes a business decision, and industry gets involved, and then the whole technology takes off.
That's right.
Otherwise, it was something for the flyboys of the military.
That's right, yeah. That's where the critical mass happens and change really takes place.
That's why, regardless of what I may think about Trump one way or another, I'm 100% with him on the Space Force.
Yeah, because that's part of the...
when he announced it, I thought, well, it's about time. Yeah. Because we need to develop this so that it's there when we need it.
Right.
And we're going to need it sooner than people think.
Yeah.
And that probably will go down as part of Trump's legacy.
Yeah. Well,
when you stop and think of it, how many presidents can say, I signed the legislation that started this major aspect of the military?
Yeah. Well, plenty of presidents. I mean, Nixon, who has kind of a tainted spot in history, started the EPA, opened the door to China. Yeah. It wouldn't be surprising if any given president would have varied aspects of their legacy.
Yeah.
How optimistic are you about the future of our planet?
I'm optimistic. I think humanity will solve the problem. But I think if you and I were to disappear here and suddenly reappear 100 years from now, you and I would not know how to interact with people, or maybe even recognize them as fellow humans.
Because of kind of robotics and AI built in?
Because of all of that stuff, and because of the change in perspective. Almost everybody we deal with maybe including ourselves sometimes, their innate view of the world, and I'm not saying they're flat earthers, they are, but it's a flat plane with lots of distances this way, an atmosphere up here, an ocean there, and that's in the back of my mind when I talk or think about anything. 100 years from now, it's going to be
the universe.
The universe.
Yeah.
It's going to be a solar system of planets and so forth, and that's part of a larger universe. It's going to be a totally different mindset. And so when you talk about ordinary human problems, the perspective you're coming from is going to be like that. That's what I think.
Huh. It must make you want to live another 90 years just to see what it looks like.
Not necessarily. I think it's going to be a rough ride.
Oh, yeah. There's a few bumps along the way.
More than a few bumps.
Yeah.
I think what's happening in Australia is illustrative. And I now see other people beginning to talk about this. But I've been concerned for a long time that we haven't seen anything in terms of migration across borders until the reason they're migrating is not because they want to get away from the bad guys or they want a better job. It's because they literally can't live where they are.
Their island is overrun by the ocean.
Or it's too hot. We may find that Phoenix has to be abandoned. It's something that air conditioning can't solve. However, I noticed that there's people out there thinking about underground living.
Oh. Huh.
And they're experimenting with this.
Yeah.
You'd only come out at night.
Yeah. Wow. I think I'd rather be in space.
Yeah.
The view would be better.
Yeah.
I have been speaking with Robert C. Cowen, retired science editor of the Christian Science Monitor. Thanks very much, Bob.
Well, thank you.
Quite a story. Bob Cowan and my father were born in the same year, 1927. That makes them both 92 years old. And Dad arrived about 110 days ahead of Bob, a point that he's reminded him of. And though they both graduated from MIT in 1949, they did not meet until this year at the place where they live west of Boston. I have to say I'm grateful for the privilege of knowing both of these men in their 10th decades. They have a similar quality of leaning into the current scene with intelligence and curiosity, and the fact that they're willing to share their long experiences in the world. Bob is a journalist and Dad is a business and banking executive is something that I'm very grateful for. It strikes me that there are many other stories ready to be recorded in this community, and folks of a lot of MIT connections and Harvard and from the area around Boston, and some folks that Dad knew in his business career. But it's a beautiful place with great views and great service and good food, and people getting to know each other and sharing life stories that span a lot of years and a lot of very significant accomplishments and experiences. Quite remarkable. That's it for this week, and I'll be back in Cambridge next week. Darlene is down in Florida with her sister Deb tonight, and I just checked the weather. It's 30 degrees warmer right now in Sanibel, Florida, compared with here in Ocean Park. It's 72 degrees in Florida and 42 degrees here in Maine. So, but we're looking forward to getting back together, I think, middle of next week. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. Bye.